Do you remember the first few weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic? Just that constant, overwhelming flood of news, right? One minute there's an update, the next there's conflicting advice. It honestly felt like trying to drink from a fire hose, and you just had no idea what was true, what was a guess, and what was just plain wrong. It was a lot.
Well, it turns out there's an official term for that feeling of being totally swamped. The World Health Organization calls it an infodemic. And the key thing here is that it's not just about misinformation. It's the sheer volume of everything, the good info and the bad, that makes it almost impossible to figure out what to do. It's like the entire information ecosystem is just thrown completely out of whack.
And this isn't a new problem, not at all. During the 1918 Spanish flu, people were convinced the virus was a bioweapon spread by German submarines. In the 80s, all the misinformation around HIV/AIDS created this terrible stigma that set public health back. And then with COVID-19, well, social media basically put this century-old problem on hyperdrive. So all of this chaos raises a really important question. In the middle of an infodemic, how do governments and health organizations even begin to build an official story? A clear narrative that we can all follow. What's the playbook? How do they try to manage the message and, hopefully, manage the actual crisis? Let's try to unpack that. Okay, so first up, the pandemic infodemic. We've all felt it, but let's dive into what it really means when that official message has to compete with a viral post that could be completely wrong.
Now, what if I told you there's kind of a playbook for this? A framework that can actually help us decode how governments try to shape what we think when things get really serious. It's called Situational Crisis Communication Theory, or SCCT for short. And at its core, it's a way to understand the very specific strategies that organizations use to protect their reputation. It's not just about giving out facts, it's about crafting a very specific story. And SCCT basically breaks it down into three main strategies. First, you've got diminish. That's all about minimizing your responsibility. Then there's rebuild, which is when you take positive steps to win back trust. And finally, reinforce. That's when you remind everyone of all the good things you've done in the past. Think of them as the three main plays in the communication playbook.
So that's the theory. But how does this stuff actually work in the real world, under pressure? Well, a really fascinating study on Turkey's communication during COVID-19 gives us a perfect look. So here's what they did. During a really critical point in the pandemic, researchers sat down and did these in-depth interviews with regular people. They wanted to know one thing. How was the government's messaging actually landing? And did it line up with that SCCT playbook we just talked about? And this is where it gets really interesting, because you can see the theory map almost perfectly to what actually happened. For that diminished strategy, the government kept using justification, right? Reminding people the virus came from China, that it was an external problem. To rebuild, they launched a huge national aid campaign called We Are Enough for Each Other. And to reinforce, they used bolstering, constantly talking up the strength of Turkey's healthcare system, especially compared to the struggles in Europe and the US.
And you know what? It worked. People noticed. One person in the study said that national aid campaign sent a powerful message that the country was self-reliant. So you see this direct line from the communication strategy to how it was actually felt by people on the ground.
But look, having a playbook is one thing. Running the plays perfectly in the middle of a chaotic game is something else entirely. Because in the messiness of a real crisis, even the best plans can go wrong, especially when it comes to the one thing that matters most, public trust.
And this slide just illustrates one of the biggest hurdles perfectly. The theory says you need one single, consistent voice to build trust. But the reality, in Turkey and in a lot of countries, was you had multiple people talking. The president, the health minister, the interior minister, and sometimes they were saying completely different things.
And that had a huge impact. One participant mentioned how frustrating it was to see different public institutions contradicting each other. They talked about the chaos when the first lockdown was just announced out of the blue, with zero warning. That kind of thing isn't just an inconvenience. It completely erodes trust at the exact moment you need it most. So, okay, we've seen the government's playbook. We've seen how they try to shape the story. But how well that playbook works really depends on us, on how we hear those messages. And that brings up a much deeper question about perception itself. To get into that, we're going to take a pretty surprising turn into a philosophy class. A professor is giving a lecture on phenomenology, which is basically the philosophy of questioning everything we think we see. And a student who is clearly getting frustrated with the whole idea asks this very personal question. But the story of how she even got to that question, that's the really interesting part. So the professor's going on about the need to challenge our basic assumptions, to not just accept what we see at face value. And this one student is getting more and more worked up. And finally, she just blurts this out. It sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? Maybe it's the dog walking the woman. I mean, come on. But that one question completely changed the conversation in the room. Because suddenly everyone else jumped in. One student said, well, my dog is always pulling ahead. Someone else pointed out, yeah, and the dog is the one who tells you when it's time to go for a walk. Then a third person says, but sometimes the human has to yank the leash back. And they all realize that this simple, everyday thing is actually this super complex dance of who's leading and who's following.
And that, right there, is the big takeaway. That crisis communication playbook we looked at, that's the government trying to lead the dance, trying to be the one holding the leash. But the reality is always a complicated push and pull. So the next time you're in a crisis, trying to make sense of the official story, just remember that dog walker and ask yourself, who's really leading here and who's following? And how can I be sure I'm seeing the whole picture?